Hello, it's been too long. I'm really excited to talk about a specific percussion concerto today. It's a percussion concerto review, not an album review, because there's a missing album that we will talk about later. The piece in question is Tan Dune's Tears of Nature. You may have heard of the Tan Dune Water Concerto, where the percussionist is playing with bowls and cups and tubs of water. This is not that. This is a more traditional percussion concerto. Both are fantastic. I will go ahead and say that I like this piece, and it leads me to dive further into it and perhaps even criticize it more harshly than a piece that I would just let kind of slip by me. So I'm going to go over what I can gather about the history of this concerto, compare some snippets of live recordings that I can, talk about the live performance that I've just seen, dissect the whole composition as much as I can. And finally, I actually want to talk about some of the reviews I've seen of this concerto, just as a way to examine what gap I'm filling with my sort of commentary versus what typically gets written about. So Tears of Nature is billed as this 27-minute percussion concerto, but it's not 27 minutes. It's way heftier. It's like a 40-minute concerto, 3 movements: summer for timpani and orchestra, autumn for marimba and orchestra, and winter for percussion and orchestra. And there are some fantastic program notes I will link and reference as we reach some applicable areas of the piece. It was largely inspired by some pretty incredible but awful and terrible acts of nature that Tan Dune either saw or experienced. The first performance was on December 13th, 2012. The piece was written and premiered by famed percussionist Martin Grubinger, and he played it with the NDR Symphony Orchestra with Tan Dune conducting in Lübeck, Germany. Shortly after, he went to the LA Phil, which was a co-commissioning orchestra, performed that Friday, January 4th, 2013, and Grubinger seems to have continued to tour all over. In fact, he also premiered it in China, which I have a review from that we can look at later. The next tour, I believe, with Tan Dune conducting, seems to be Alexei Gerasim's in 2017. There was a music festival performance by Bebe Wang in 2023. Big gap there. I mean, both of those are large gaps. And finally, the live performance that kicked all this off for me, February 2026, Edward Bayens plays it with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. So let's talk through the piece. So I think, just as a reviewer, I got a pretty good look at this piece. Edward Bayens is my percussion professor at University of Maryland. He played the whole solo part for me, and then I also saw it live. Got to dive into the score a little bit. So I'll talk through the piece and talk about what I think really works and maybe what doesn't. So Movement 1, Summer, for timpani and orchestra, begins with the percussionist at the front of the stage playing 2 rocks. It's not played up for novelty or anything like that. It's just this very simple, I don't know, it's like this music concrete sound or something, but also it's rocks, so it's very evocative. Opening and closing the palm of the hand to get different strikes and sounds between both the percussionist and the soloist. Very simple intro, and soon the percussionist walks back to the rear of the stage and begins to play on a group of maybe it's 6 timpani. So Movement 1 is interesting. It has some really great orchestral writing, and the timpani writing is cool in hindsight. Once in the later movements you get like the clear statement of themes on like marimba and vibraphone, you can then be like, oh, that's what the timpani was playing. But it just doesn't come through right away. I think the orchestra part is great in Movement 1, but it's probably the weakest solo writing. Particularly, there's this point where you're doing this vast amount of specific flicking, tapping, and closing with your hand, playing with your hands on the timpani. It's not very clear to the audience. It's not very effective. And it's the kind of thing that can really make it hard to attract performers to champion this work because, it just seems like a pain to play. The transition back to timpani happens with two cupped cymbals played remarkably similar to the two rocks. It's all about cupping and smashing and scraping them to get different sounds. There's some really fantastic dramatic moments in that. So the two transition moments, I'm not sure what to say about them now because we're going to talk about them when we get to the reviews. So I'll just leave that there for now. We then go into Autumn for marimba and orchestra. And this movement is incredible. It has some of the most simplistic, like Chinese folk song adaptations, but the way that the marimba just gets to be so lyrical and really blends with the orchestra is just phenomenal, and it's gorgeous. It's spellbinding. I really loved it. And it's enough to make me, want to deal with all the timpani stuff and all the drum stuff that comes later just to play those gorgeous marimba passages. There's these few different themes we have that get woven together at different times. They'll continue to get expanded and then woven back together in Winter, the third movement for percussion and orchestra. This is where we get a lot of drumming, a lot of tom-tom work. This movement has some real highs and a few things, again, that don't quite work. The drum passages largely work, although sometimes they're just a bit abrupt. There's also just these very few entrances of 5 cowbells and wooden wind chimes that just doesn't quite, that could maybe be in the percussion section or just not part of the setup, because what works incredibly well in this third movement is where the soloist, and as described in the program notes, the soloist uses assorted percussion instruments all placed in a circle, shaking a rain stick with one hand, twirling around and playing the different themes broken up between vibraphone, glockenspiel, marimba, tuned toms, and tuned gongs. That setup that is used for this dancing spirit passage is the heart and soul of this piece, and it's so effective. Everything else to me could be trimmed out. That setup, that balance of motivic material is what really makes it work. So there's a first level of description and critique. Let me put some different lenses on this to kind of further elucidate the concerto. There's only snippets I can find on this of Alexei and Martin Grubinger playing this. When Martin Grubinger played this, he seems to have approached it with his classic and impressive blend of energy, athleticism, and showmanship. All of those are his strengths, and he does them incredibly well. And the piece was written for him. And I guess here's the bombshell. I think he's completely wrong for the piece. Everything that is special about this piece is in the understated, sincere moments. And approaching it through virtuosity just doesn't work very well, in my opinion. I was completely impressed by Edward Bayan's performance of it with Baltimore. He had such a introspective way of playing it, but it was so meticulous and confident that even though it was an introspective performance, which could sometimes be a negative, it was really magnetic and charismatic just because of the level of expertise and detail that he brought to everything. The beautiful spiritual passages were the focus, not in any way to demonstrate virtuosity, but as ways to and areas in which to express emotion, feeling, intellectuality, spirituality. And it really worked. Let's continue to home in on this idea by looking at a couple different reviews. From the LA Times, Mark Swed from Grubinger's LA premiere that we discussed. Tandun describes the Tears of Nature as a cautionary concerto. Throughout the music, he is quoted in the program notes as saying, "Nature's tears tell us that the threat to our survival is ourselves." That's quite a message for abstract music to convey, Mark Swed writes. Without more specific help decoding the score's ecological semiotics, I'll steer clear of interpreting the symbolism. Simply getting a handle on Tan's music is a task in itself. This is simultaneously a pretentious and lazy introduction to a review. It is both apathetic and ignorant. If Tan's music is hard for him to get a handle on, who is a relatively conservative writer when it comes to percussion, then I can't imagine this writer would be equipped to handle much else at all. The first movement began stunningly with a muted harp sounding like an twanging Asian instrument. Come on. The soloist taps stones. He goes to a bank of timpani on which he pounded with mad abandon before quietly tapping his stones once more as he returned to the front of the stage. Again, that is just... Attention focused on Grubinger, who is not just an athletic percussionist, but also an acrobatic one. The cadenzas appeared designed for an octopus, with Grubinger ever grasping for bowls, blocks, bells, gongs, drums, marimba, vibraphone, and rain stick. Okay, you can probably tell I don't like this review, but let's keep going for now. Tandun and Shostakovich form a dark, compelling program in Vienna. This was 2014. Tears of Nature was composed for the superfluously talented Martin Grubinger. Though the Vienna Symphony Orchestra lacked a bit of spirit, especially in the first movement, Grubinger's energy was absolutely infectious, and by the middle of the second movement, at the latest, we were all sold. So here, perhaps, Grubinger's energy is, who can deny it's the type of thing that makes a soloist, right? Regardless of the effort level and involvement of the orchestra or whatever the piece is, you yourself can elevate the material through sheer force of will. The third movement is described as starting with a whip crack and whirls the percussionist through a variety of xylophones, drums, gongs, and noisemakers, sometimes simultaneously. Okay, another review. In Shanghai, Grubinger played dozens of percussion instruments, flicking, rubbing, and scraping them to draw out unexpected sounds. The effort more than justified the wardrobe decision of the musician. Oh, because they talked about he was only wearing a t-shirt. During the first piece, he even performed a short ritual dance, wandering among the orchestra members, clicking 2 small rocks as an instrument. The physically exhausting work taxed the sweating percussionist so much, he joked afterwards, that he looked as if he was coming straight out of the swimming pool. Okay, so all of those reviews only talk about percussion in terms of novelty and physicality. And I think that represents just, on the part of the reviewers, I think it's laziness. I'm sure we've all read these movie reviews, right? Where they describe what happens in the movie and you're like, okay, cool, there's the outline, then what really worked. But no, that was it. Describing what happened in the movie was the whole review, apparently. That's not a review. Saying that somebody played a bunch of percussion instruments and that a lot of the percussion instruments sounded crazy is not a review. I mean, it can't be valuable in any way other than just being like this sort of byline press release garbage. You can tell me in the comments, what I'm successful at, but I mean, I know I give overviews of each thing, but I want to talk about each piece as if I've listened to it, you've listened to it, and now let's talk about what works, what doesn't, what was impactful to you, what didn't happen. And what's frustrating to me with this piece, Tears of Nature, is more than perhaps any other percussion concerto I've seen, it's not about the novelty. It's not about the athleticism. What works here, again, is the intimacy, the spirituality, the intentionality behind every moment. Even when the piece was introduced in Baltimore, and it was an amazing, amazing performance that I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. The kind of byline was that, oh, Ed bought these rocks at Home Depot. It's not about the rocks. It's about, as soon as it began playing, you understand this isn't some novelty. This is about instantly connecting you to a natural geological sound. I don't care where the rocks came from, just like we never talk about what horse's tail the violin bow hairs were picked from. Percussion concerti are never going to be talked about like they should be, even if they're bad percussion concerti, if all we can do is just this kind of zoo, oh, that was so athletic, that was so novel. Those rocks in the first movement, one of the best passages is that the rocks are played in the front of the stage by the soloist, and then it cascades back through the rest of the percussionists. Where do you hear cascading rocks? You hear it in the most awful moments of rock slides, of earthquakes, of disasters. That's powerful. That's going to connect to what you've seen and heard in some of the worst moments of your life, perhaps, if you've experienced those things. It's not novelty, it's reality. I was just talking about how the timpani passages I don't think really work. It doesn't quite come across clearly, But boy, I wouldn't describe it as playing on them with abandon. And maybe that's a failure of Grubinger in that moment, right? If it just looks like you're wailing back there, then you've not communicated something to the audience. If the focus is that you're sweaty at the end of the concerto, then I think that's a miss. I really do not want to come across as disrespecting Grubinger's amazing performances. There's just some thread or connection in my mind that I'm trying to unravel of if, as performers, we emphasize the energetic and athletic and novel way that many percussion instruments are played, then that's just kind of falling into the trap that many people have already laid for us in their mind. What I was so impressed by in Edward Bayan's performance was that physicality was an afterthought. Music was everything. And that music was beautiful. It was evocative. It was lovely. It was, the marimba playing with the strings was just magical. It inspired me. It really made me feel something about the power of percussion to cut through the layers of aesthetic preferences that we might have and focus on nature, sound, rhythm, frequency. So, for a reviewer to say, boy, I'll steer clear of interpreting symbolism. I don't know about this ecological semiotics. That's quite a message for abstract music to convey. Percussion is the least abstract thing on the planet. This is going to be a nightmare to edit. To wrap up, each of the percussionists ended the piece slightly differently that I saw. Gruminger ended it with like a whisper of a roll on marimba. Didn't work at all. It was just odd. I mean, he was touring with a concerto, so I'm sure he was just trying different things. That was just odd. Gerasimez ended it with just kind of some taiko drumming. Ed Bands ended it with grabbing a huge bass drum mallet and absolutely what? Again, I'm going to fall into the same trap. It didn't seem like he was whacking it. It didn't seem like he was hammering it. It didn't seem like he was pounding on it with mad abandon. He got a big bass drum. He used a huge bass drum mallet, and he pulsed the whole concert hall together. You could feel it. Unified the audience to the orchestra. From any of the recordings I've seen, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra was by far the most invested, prepared, and precise. Congratulations to all of them. There was an all-star cast of like Sean Tilburg, Ted Atkatz playing in the percussion section for this performance. And this seems like a piece, Tandun Tears of Nature, this seems like a piece that has a really high ceiling of expressivity and power, but that if you're not careful can devolve into some drummy novelty athleticism. That a lot of concerti can do that, and sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. But this concerto has the material that can really affect somebody. And that's what should be brought out and focused upon, both in the performance, both in the listening, and both in the discussion of this piece. I hate to see that so many people have just kind of bypassed that. What would help is if we had recordings of this piece, and we don't. Now, interestingly, there's this Decca Classics press release about them signing Tandun, and they say, a major world premiere recording of Tears of Nature will follow in September 2023. The 25-minute percussion concerto, how does it keep getting shorter? It's like 40 minutes. So they were supposed to release an album of this in 2023. I could not get a hold of Decca for any sort of comment or information on this. Probably no surprise. But I really hope that this concerto comes out. I would love to hear a lot of different people's take on it. Hopefully I can convince Baltimore to give me a recording of it. This has been interesting. I've tried to record this a couple times, and I planned out a lot to talk about, and as soon as I got going, I'll try to fix it in editing. But I hope that some of this is interesting to you, and I hope you'll tell me what you think about this problem of how percussion is perceived and even how it's written for. Because what's kind of interesting in all this is that Tandun both composed these kind of amazing subtle passages and also composed some of this, kind of ridiculously fast drummy stuff because he knew Martin Grubinger was going to play it. And he himself did not seem to have quite the idea of what was special and what was not, which often it does, often you can only find out what is magical about a piece through live performance. So I'm not blaming him there. Now, in terms of my dialogue with you, the viewer, I know you don't really have a way to listen to this piece, and I know that can kind of flatten this whole discussion. But these ideas are something I'll continue to talk about in further discussion of percussion pieces and concerti, and I hope you'll give me some of your thoughts in the comments on what I've been talking about. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week.